His name may not be familiar to you, but this is John Brown. John Brown was enslaved in the mid-1800s and subjected to excruciating experiments by a Georgia doctor named Thomas Hamilton. Hamilton believed there were physiological differences between black and white people, and he used Brown's body to prove it. After he escaped slavery, Brown described what happened to him in an autobiography. Dr. Hamilton set to work to ascertain how deep my black skin went. This he did by applying blisters to my hands, legs, and feet, which bear the scars to this day. That happened because Dr. Hamilton, a slave owner, was trying to scientifically bolster the prevailing ideology that black people were mentally and physically inferior to white people and therefore benefited from enslavement. That thinking was so pervasive at the time, it spawned propaganda like this print from slavery apologists who pushed a narrative that enslaved blacks in the U.S. were better off than white factory workers in Britain. And it provided material for slaveholders like South Carolina Senator John Calhoun, who in an 1837 speech argued that slavery was a boon to black people. Never before has the black race of Central Africa, from the dawn of history to the present day, attained a condition so civilized and so improved, not only physically, but morally and intellectually. This kind of thinking gave rise to junk science like drapetomania, which translates to runaway madness. It was a clinical term of the 1850s based on the belief that slavery so vastly improved the lives of the enslaved, they would have to be mentally ill to run away. The term drapetomania was not removed from medical textbooks until after 1914. Human experiments and racist propaganda and fake science were used to prove something that we all know now is patently false. Black people did not benefit from slavery, quite obviously. But this year, in Florida, the echoes of those falsehoods can be heard once again. Yesterday, the Florida Board of Education approved new standards for Black history instruction that require lessons for middle schoolers to include, quote, how slaves developed skills, which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. The old racist trope from the 1850s that slavery benefited the enslaved seems to have been resurrected in Florida, and middle schoolers in that state may be required to learn it. As part of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' efforts to whitewash black history, high schoolers in the state's public school system will now be taught that race massacres, like the racial terror in Ocoee in 1920, the largest incidents of voting day violence in American history, that those massacres included acts of violence perpetrated against and by African Americans. In reality, it was a white mob that killed 60 people in Ocoee after a black man tried to vote. But those guidelines are part of a new set of standards that Florida's Board of Education approved yesterday, downplaying America's history of anti-black violence. And as part of their campaign to Make America Florida, state officials want to export those standards nationally.
B1 family, welcome to BlackLogic. We are all aware of the recent mass killings of our people in Jacksonville, Florida. Well, Ron DeSantis had been trying to cover this up by not mentioning anything that's anti-woke, meaning anti-black, as well as this suggesting that slavery benefited black people. Where do you think the killer got his rhetoric from? Where you believe the shooter got his perspective from is by the racist and anti-black narrative of people like Governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis. When I look at this legislation, when we take a dive into this, it states that with NBC News, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis stood by a new provision in the state's educational guidelines that implied that freed black Americans benefit from chattel slavery, claiming it would teach students that enslaved people eventually parlayed, being a blacksmith into doing things later in life. That means they developed skills in spite of slavery, not because of slavery, DeSantis added. It was then showing resourcefulness then using those skills once slavery ended. The remarks came as DeSantis also attempted to distance himself from the same provisions. I didn't do it. I wasn't involved. He didn't. This is the racist things that white supremacists, anti-black honorary KK members say. It also goes on to say, instructions for high school students about several race massacres, including the 1921 bombing of Black Wall Street and the 1920 OC massacre, which includes acts of violence perpetrated by Black Americans. See, this is how they're flipping the script and changing history and implementing falsehoods about the way things occurred in history. This is reversing history, same way as Texas is doing in some regards, and stating by alleviating the word slave and replacing the word with laborer, which is all falsehood of historical things that occurred in history, the historical labeling of accurate accounts of history. Secondly, it says middle schoolers must learn about how slaves developed skills, which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. Of course, there's been a lot of pushback with these lies that Ron DeSantis has been spewing, which, in my opinion, allegedly encourage the shooter of killing our 3 Black brothers and sisters. So very quickly, I want to go over some of the tragedies, unfortunately, the massacres, the race riots that our people have incurred since we landed foot of those who came over from the continent of Africa and those who were already here. We understand that the history of foundational Black Americans started back in 1526, so we must start there. It states here, regrettably, racial violence has been a distinct part of American history since the 1660s, which it goes further back than that. While the violence has impacted almost every ethnic and racial group in the United States, it has a particularly horrific effect on Black Americans' life. Listed below are some of the major incidents of racial violence profiled on blackpast.org, which you guys can go and reference this very same information. They first start off with the revolts of Black enslaved people, and it starts off with the 1526, as we always state, how those Spanish conquistadors brought over 100 Black enslaved people who then revolted and escaped with the other melanated people that were already here. That's from the inception. You go on to the New York City slave uprising, the New York City slave conspiracy, Denmark's vessel conspiracy of 1822, of course, the most notable and honorary Nat Turner Revolt of 1831. We get into antebellum urban violence with the Cincinnati riots, the anti-abolition riots, Cincinnati race riots of 1836, the Pennsylvania Hall Fire of 1838, moving on to the Civil War Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction era violence of the Detroit race riots of 1863. We're going to skip down to the Marion race riots of 1861, Curry County Courthouse Massacre of 1886. We're going right into the race riots of 1900 to 1960, the New York City race riots in the 1900s, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania race riot of 1918. And then we have the Red Summer of 1919, where the majority of cities were predominantly Black, had race riots of sailors and other military personnel that were white that started killing people in particular neighborhoods that were majority Black simply because of the color of their skin. Washington, D.C., my hometown riot. Chicago race riot. Knoxville race riot. Elaine, Arkansas race riot. Then, of course, 2 years later, the Tulsa race massacre of 1921, the Rosewood massacre of 1923, Harlem race riot of 1935, the Baltimore race riot of 1943, Detroit race riot of 1943, Columbia race riot of 1946, the Peekskill riot of 1949, and then the Cicero riot of 1951. And then from the 1960 to the 2000, we have all sorts of uprising within the United States because of race-led riots and anti-Black disinformation that comes from allegedly KKK honorary members like Ron DeSantis that spew in front of the whole state of Florida. The Cambridge, Maryland riot, the Harlem race riot, the Chicago riots, the Philadelphia race riot. You're going to see these things go over and over and over again. Ever since the 1500s, family, our people have been enduring, have been surviving race riots and massacres and fighting back against the system of anti-Blackness and white supremacy. And if you do your research, family, you will see that race riots occurred in almost every major city in small towns within the United States of America, and even college campus riots of 1960, of the Georgia desegregation riot, the Ole Miss riot, the Houston, Texas Southern University riot, the Orangeburg Massacre riot, Jackson State killings of 1970, the Southern University shooting of 1972, and it goes on and on and on again. This is not history in which we are witnessing, family. This is our current present day of us continually to be targeted. And this country, the United States of America, your president that you voted in with 87% of the black vote, has still foregone to give black Americans an anti-hate crime bill and making black Americans a protected class. Why is that? Because if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Far too long, we continue to vote people into office asking for nothing, with no tangibles on the table. If we haven't learned with Barack Obama, if we haven't learned with Bill Clinton, if we haven't learned with Donald Trump, and we haven't learned this term with Joe Biden, when are black Americans are going to learn that unless something is on the table, hold your vote and use it as a bargaining chip? Because the only power that we have in this nation is our power to unify, organize, and vote. If you believe in that your ancestors fought and bled for you to have the right to vote, understand having the right is also the option. We must unify and organize our vote to vote those from a grassroots level into office, from the city councilman to the governor to the United States of America, in order for us to receive what's owed to us in the form of reparations, in the form of being a protected class for United States freedmen, for foundational black Americans. Now, Hank Sanders wrote a letter to Ron DeSantis stating that Florida public schools teaching that some black Americans who were slaves learned skills that benefited them later in life, calling this concept sad and preposterous. This is more not of an idea. This was actually passed in Florida state legislation. So this is not just an idea. This is ideology that white supremacists have now implemented in the core nucleus of the Board of Education to be taught to every white, black, Hispanic, Asian, and everyone else who will be attending these so-called schools. And this is what's important for us to understand. This is no concept. This is no perspective. This is now written to the Board of Education for your children to learn and understand in the way the white supremacist anti-black want them to learn it. It states here that the Florida Board of Education adopted new standards for social studies lessons that include examining the various duties and trades performed by slaves: agricultural work, painting, carpentry, tailoring, domestic service, blacksmith, and transportation. The one thing they're not telling you here, family, is that a lot of these Africans, our ancestors that came over from the continent, and those who were already here, already had these skills, already had walls and constructions and buildings in the continent of Africa, what attracted the Europeans to come over and colonize them and enslave them and ship their bodies across the entire world as property. So don't let these white supremacists fool you that they somehow learned these skills while they were slaves. Most of them already came over here with said skills. It states here that Sanders, who is black, wrote that slaveholders, their families, and their business associates were the only ones who benefit from slavery. Absolutely. Governor DeSantis, slavery did not provide benefits to enslaved people, but rather robbed them of every benefit, Sanders wrote. He called on DeSantis to denounce a fraudulent interpretation of our history. He knows that it's fraudulent. He knows that it's misinformation. He knows that it's disinformation. But he knows in which the party, and not just the political party, but the party of white supremacy. This is why he's done it. This is why it's just passed through the legislature of Florida State. And this is why it's part of the Board of Education and will be taught to your children. It goes on to say, after all, history is forged so we can learn from it to build a better future, Sanders wrote, and change history as false history, and false history results in false learning that allow us to repeat terrible wrongs like slavery. You are intentionally misinterpreting. Even though we know that this country has benefited from slavery in the form of capitalism. That capitalism is inherently slavery and slavery is inherently capitalism. But when you also get into the hangings, the torture, the murdering, the dismemberment, the raping, and everything else that occurred during this very long time by the way of slavery, Jim Crow, and present day, our people are still going through some of the same things. And anytime a lot of these white supremacists get pushed back from their party, get pushed back from their voting base, a lot of them turn the tide and start to apologize. Not Ron DeSantis. Oh no, not Florida State Governor. It states here, despite the strong backlash from Democrats and fellow Republicans, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is tripling down on his state newly approved social studies curriculum guidelines that erroneously teach students that enslaved people develop skills that they could use for personal benefit. Since news of the state's new standards gained attention in mid-July, DeSantis have faced criticism, including from 4 of the 5 black congressional Republicans, almost all of whom support former President Donald Trump for the Republican nomination. What slavery was really about was separating families, about mutilating humans, and even raping their wives, said Republican Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina. Absolutely not, Tim Scott. Absolutely not. Slavery was a system created by the backs of black people in order to build a white supremacist nation of free labor. It wasn't about just separating fucking families, Tim Scott. It was about money. It was about stinking, greedy, white supremacy money. What about all the things that our forefathers and our ancestors have done to build this nation? If it was just about separating families, Tim Scott, then why did slaves build the Capitol? Why did slaves build the monument? Why did slaves build the very infrastructure and foundation of America if it was simply about separating families? Don't have no one, white, black, Asian, Hispanic, or otherwise, tell you the lies that slavery was about separating fucking families, because it was not. Yes, it did mutilate black people. Yes, it did rape our men and women by the way of buck breaking when it comes to men. But you're talking about the number one thing was about separating families, then you've already missed the train. And this is why people like Tim Scott, no matter his color, will ever become president, because he's spewing these white supremacist lies talking about it was about separating family. No, it was about money. It was about the torture of one people and one people alone, and that's foundation Black American U.S. freedmen. That is what it's about. And also by reading this, what it did for me, it made me do just a little bit of research here, family, because I really wanted to understand 2 things. 1, the true timeline of Jim Crow, according to some researchers, back in 1877 and lasted to 1964. Jim Crow lasted almost 100 years. And during that time, between 1945 and 1964, guess what was established during this timeline between 1945 and 1964 that was already in place? You got it, the United Nations. The United Nations Human Rights. And during this time, do you believe that there was any reports of violation of human rights of foundational Black Americans in the United States of America? Absolutely not. And if it did, it was a blimp on the radar. It went absolutely nowhere, because the United States of America is one of the forefathers of creating the United Nations. Let me go a little bit deeper with that. It states here, 4 months after San Francisco Conference ended, the United Nations officially began on 24 October 1945, when it came into existence after its charter had been ratified by China, France, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America, and by a majority of other signatories. And family, if you don't believe me, you go right to their website, and it shows right here that the United States of America date of admission was 24 October 1945. So if you think it was about separating families, Tim Scott, then why wasn't this reported to the United Nations, in which the United States of America was a forefather in reporting violations against humanity of one people? It was about mutilating human beings, because the United States is the forefather, is the head, is the president of white supremacy for the entire globe. So from Ron DeSantis to Donald Trump to Joe Biden to Tim Scott for Varika Ramaswamy, all of these are white supremacists, no matter the color of their skin. Because there's one of two things. Can you be a white supremacist and have dark skin? Absolutely not. But you can be a crony, you can be a representative, you can be a coon, you can be a bootlicker, you can do the bidding of the white supremacist master, and your ass is just a public. The system of anti-blackness and white supremacy will always, history has repeated itself over and over again, will break you. Because when we look at slavery, slavery was a grave violation of human rights that caused immense suffering of our people, immense pain of our people, and deaths for millions of our people. It's crucial to acknowledge the immense physical and, most importantly, psychological harm inflicted on the foundation of U.S. freedmen family and the individuals and us being their descendants that has been going on since the inception of slavery. While some plantation owners and industries in the South and North and East and West from its slave labor, it's essential to differentiate between the economic gains, not the separating families, Tim Scott, but the economic gains of a few and the widespread oppression and poverty experienced by the black family during that time and still going on today in some regards. Slavery's legacy has left a lasting impact on black communities, including systematic racism, economic disparities, and social inequalities. It's misleading to suggest that slavery, Ron DeSantis, that slavery benefited black people when its consequences continue to affect the black family today. The statement overlooks the agency of black people who resisted slavery, who fought for our freedom, and played pivotal roles in building their community despite the oppressive system. Focusing on the resiliency and the determination is a more accurate historical perspective, is it not? The contribution of black people to American society, culture, and economy often go unrecognized when statements like these are made, these very white supremacy statements, from music and art to science and politics. Black people have made significant contributions throughout history, which should not be overshadowed by the horrors of slavery and the disinformation and misinformation that our people have benefited from slavery. It's important to rely on accurate historical scholarship and consensus when discussing the impact of slavery. Promoting misleading information only hinders our ability to understand and learn from history. From genuine racial reconciliation and progress, it's important to acknowledge the historical injustice, promote understanding, and work towards healing, rather than perpetuating divisive, racist, discriminatory narratives as Ron DeSantis have done here, which one of the major causes of Ryan Palmetto to go out and kill 3 innocent black people. And while he was at this vigil for the victims, he was booed, as he should have been. But wait, family, there's a lot more here to cover.
We're learning more this morning about the white gunman who killed 3 black people in a racially motivated attack at a Dollar General store in Jacksonville, Florida. Police are now saying the gunman left behind a suicide note and pages upon pages of hate-filled writings. NBC News national correspondent Gabe Gutierrez has the latest.
I am tired.
This morning, a Jacksonville community is grieving the stunning loss of 3 people shot to death in what police say was a racially motivated attack. The FBI is investigating the shooting as a hate crime. Police say the gunman, 21-year-old Ryan Christopher Palmetto, sent racist writings to local law enforcement, the media, even his own parents, expressing his desire to kill black people. Officials releasing video of the gunman in a tactical vest before he opened fire in the parking lot and then inside a Dollar General store Saturday afternoon.
He let several people out of the store. Why, I don't know. Some of them were white, but I do believe there was a couple that were not.
The victims, identified as Angela Carr, Gerald Deshaun Gallion, and 19-year-old store employee Anult Joseph Laguerre Jr., known as AJ.
Why does he have to go now? Why so young?
Gerald Gallion's family says he worked hard to take care of his 4-year-old daughter.
All my grandbaby keeps saying is, "Where's my daddy?" And all I can do is grab her because I don't have the words right now.
Before the shooting, police say the gunman stopped at nearby Edward Waters University, a historically black institution where a school security officer saw him and called police to report a suspicious person on campus.
What he did is totally unacceptable in the state of Florida.
At a prayer vigil, Governor Ron DeSantis vowing to provide more security to Florida HBCUs, but facing boos from the crowd. DeSantis has faced backlash over efforts to change black history education in public schools, with new curriculum standards including a controversial provision that some slaves develop skills that could be used for their personal benefit.
So that means they develop skills in spite of slavery, not because of slavery.
Meanwhile, authorities say the shooter, who took his own life when officers arrived, lived with his parents in this home outside Jacksonville. Adding a suicide note was found in his bedroom. An AR-style rifle and a handgun, one covered in hand-drawn swastikas, were recovered at the scene.
His sickening ideology is not representative of the values of this Jacksonville community.
Yes, it is. It's indicative of Florida. It's indicative of Texas. It's indicative of Washington State. It's indicative of California. It's indicative of Minnesota. Must I go on? It's indicative to the United States that we have white supremacist, anti-black ideology that encourages, motivates, and incites people to do random acts of killings and violence towards one group of people and one group of people alone. Foundational black Americans, those U.S. freedmen.
The Office of the Medical Examiner has positively identified the shooter as Ryan Christopher Palmetter. The shooter was 21 years of age when he committed yesterday's atrocities. He lived with his parents in Orange Park in Clay County, Florida. To our knowledge, he had no criminal arrest history. And as I said yesterday, he did have a Baker Act petition from 2017. This petition occurred in Clay County, and it appears that the shooter was held for 72 hours under the Baker Act provisions and then released without further involuntary commitment. At 1:08, an 11-round shot spotter activated. At 1:08 and 13 seconds, the suspect's on video in the parking lot in front of the store, shooting into a black Kia and murders the first victim, Ms. Angela Carr. The suspect enters a Dollar General store and engages the second victim. I saw a young 19-year-old victim, Anult Laguerre. At 1:09 and 50 seconds, the first 911 call goes out. At 1:10 and 30 seconds, victim Jared Gallion enters the store with his girlfriend. At 1:13 and 5 seconds, one round shot spotter initiates once again. At 1:13 and 10 seconds, the suspect shoots a third victim, Gerald Gallion. At 1:18, the suspect texts his father and says, "Use a screwdriver to get into my room." The father enters the room and finds a last will and testament of the suspect along with a suicide note on his laptop. At 1:19 and 21 seconds, the officers enter the building and begin to clear. Just 11 minutes after this whole ordeal began. Patrol clearing the hallway when an officer hears a single gunshot. We believe that's when he killed himself. From what I'm understanding from our lieutenant here, he let several people out of the store. Why, I don't know. Some of them were white, but I do believe there was a couple that were not. But what I'm telling you is, where it stands right now, there was nothing that we could have done to stop him from owning it.
Well, we have to understand here that the Baker's Act was implemented for Ron Palmetto because of severe mental issues. Now, no one knows the conclusion of the Baker's Act being implemented, meaning was he medically cleared? Was he deemed now sane after 72 hours of going under an evaluation? These are some of the results that we need to know, because someone simply going into a mental institution doesn't necessarily mean that they are insane or off the rocker, so to speak. But what's important is the information entailed inside of those mental health records to determine if this person is a risk to the public, is this person is a risk to to society, because if there's anything in this medical report that deems that he is a risk to society, then it goes on to the medical facilities for not reporting this. And some of you are going to say that there's HIPAA laws and this, that, and the other. Well, things need to change in the United States of America. If people are having these so-called mental health episodes to act on racially motivated killings, then something needs to connect here. The medical agencies need to be in touch with law enforcement agencies and restrict this person's Second Amendment rights, because they're not in their right minds. They're not sane. But family, we have been knowing this and we've been saying this far too often. This has nothing to do with this young man's mental health condition. This has everything to do with the white supremacist perspective of Florida and those white supremacists that reside in there by the leadership of no other than Governor Ron DeSantis, who encourages such things by using terms as anti-woke and stop woke. What do you think stop woke means? Stop woke means stop black people. Stop black people from doing what? Stop black people from doing anything. This is the country that we live in. And this is not just Florida. Florida is just being highlighted at the time, but we know that this moves just like the weather from one state to another. Exercise your Second Amendment rights, the right to bear arms. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So I think that the NRA should be very happy that I'm encouraging black people to go out and exercise their Second Amendment rights, which gives them the right to bear arms in this free nation that foundational Black Americans built from the ground up. Go out and exercise your right to bear arms, meaning in the form of protection, not an offensive of anything, but in the defense of yourself, your family, and your people. We must exercise our right to bear arms legally. Secondly, we must understand the laws in which certain provisions have us to open carry, those with and without permits, and also states that require permit if concealed. I encourage all my melanated brothers and sisters to go out and get your concealed hand carry, because unfortunately we live in a country where racial discrimination, racial bias, and police brutality exists when it comes to black people. So more times than not, you may think that it may be safer if a police officer sees you with a weapon versus thinking you have a weapon. But does it really matter? Family, really, does it really matter if they know you have a gun or not? Because history tells us, statistics tell us, the FBI.gov reports tells us, innocent black people have been killed, have been shot and killed by the police, whether they have a gun or not, whether the gun was being pointed at the police or not. So it really doesn't matter. I'm just giving you my own personal preference that you should exercise your legal right to bear arms and to get your concealed handgun permit. So those states that are depicted in green are open carry without a permit, as long as you don't have a felony, and you might want to check on your misdemeanor charges if you have those as well. Those that are depicted in a light yellow color, open carry with a permit. Those states that are in red, open carry not allowed, most meaning you need to have a concealed handgun carry license. And then the orange, anonymously open carry, you have to read more into that as well. And then lastly, those of you who may need help with the legislation and understanding certain gun laws within your prospective states, those who you may need handgun training and rifle training, those of you who may need some safety classes, I would advise you to go over to the National African American Gun Association. I'm really not too keen on the name, but nonetheless, it's for our people to help us to better understand the laws. And this particular organization I am a part of, they don't know that I'm promoting them in this particular way, but family, I believe this would do your just due to answer all of your questions and help you guys to have you guys properly trained on firearms and also the proper training you need for self-defense. This is very, very important that now, one, you understand the laws therein, would it be the federal law as well as your state laws, And then the most second important thing is firearms training, knowing how to properly store the firearm, how to properly load the firearm, and then thirdly, most importantly, how to fire the firearm and defend yourself, your family, and your people. Let the Montgomery boat brawl spirit reside in you, and understand, until we do for self, history will continue to repeat itself unless we do something about it. Be one.